Well, hello everyone. It's time for our lesson this week. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 today. And the objectives in this chapter will be to understand why Paul felt it necessary to engage in foolish boasting, and to see how one might be misled by false apostles and deceitful workers, which is very pertinent for today, and to appreciate the great amount of suffering Paul endured as a minister of Christ, because as Christians, I guarantee we're all going to be facing some kind of suffering in one form or another, because Satan is at work full time to try and get us to deviate from what the Lord wants us to do. So, the summary of this chapter, as Paul continues defending his apostolic authority, he finds it necessary to engage in a little folly, so to speak. He does this out of concern for their faithfulness to Christ and his fear that others may have corrupted their minds from the simplicity that is in Christ. And we see that a lot today, that people just complicate things when it's a whole lot simpler than it is. He also explains why he did not accept support from them. Evidently, this was the basis for charges against him, that those considered themselves the most eminent apostles. But Paul, who had good reasons for not accepting their support, recognizes these detractors as what they really were: false apostles and deceitful workers. And then it goes on, and while not desiring to act foolishly, he finds it necessary, it seems, that the Corinthians are so willing to accept those who do. Sometimes a lot of things are accepted because it just seems easier, quicker, and sounds more entertaining or more productive, or whatever the case may be. So with some foolish boldness, Paul then claims equal footing with his detractors as it pertains to the physical heritage. But in what comes to service as a minister of Christ, he far surpasses them, as is evident in the things that he suffered. After listing many examples of suffering, he concludes that if he must boast, it would be in the things which concern his infirmity, giving his escape from Damascus as an illustration. So, we'll go in the outline of this chapter, and it begins with the necessity for some foolish boasting. See, out of concern for their faithfulness, he resorts to a little folly, because the godly jealousy he seeks to present them as a chaste virgin to Christ. And that's the first two verses. Then, because of their seeming willingness to receive all those who offer a different Jesus, spirit, and gospel, he fears that their minds may have been corrupted. That's 3 and 4. So, and next, because of the comparison with false apostles, though untrained in speech, it is not the case with knowledge. Paul has demonstrated that he is not inferior to the most eminent apostles. The reason he refused to accept support from them, because while with them he received support from other churches. He determined to continue this practice of not being a burden to them. Next we see, not because he does not love them, excuse me, but to be cut off opportunity for those who wish to be regarded as Paul in manners of which they boast. These boasters were false apostles. As deceitful workers, they transformed themselves into apostles of Christ. This is no great marvel, for if Satan transforms himself into an angel of the light, similar tactics can be expected of his ministers. Next we see, with great reluctance, in verses 16 through 21. For those who think Paul as a fool, then receive him as a fool, as he begins to boast. Boasting is foolish and not of the Lord, but seeing that many boast, they may seem to pull him up with them gladly in their wisdom, then Paul will boast too. Since they seem willing to endure those who abuse them, Paul will be bold and boast a little as well. Now, the grounds for this foolish boasting. First of all, his physical heritage. Like his opponents, he's a Hebrew. Like his opponents, he's an Israelite. Like his opponents, he is of the seed of Abraham. Now, his sacrificial service as a minister of Christ, it is foolish to speak of his opponents as ministers of Christ, but if so, Paul is one much more. He has labored more and suffered more than they. A list of suffering Paul endured as a minister of Christ. 5 times he was beaten with 39 stripes by the Jews. 3 times he has been beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. Night and day in the deep. Miscellaneous perils on his many journeys, miscellaneous discomforts, his daily concern for the condition of the churches. If he must boast, let it be concerning his infirmity. His infirmity, possibly his thorn in the flesh, was the persecution he endured in the service of Christ, an example of having to flee Damascus. So let's look at the questions for this chapter and look at them and review them. First question, of course, is the main points, and that's a necessity for some foolish boasting. The grounds for that foolish boasting. And next is, how did Paul desire to present the Corinthians to Christ as a chaste virgin? What was Paul fearful of concerning the Corinthians? That their minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. In other words, being taken away or fascinated by somebody else's teachings. They may be more enticing or more entertaining or whatever the case. And we need to remain just with the simplicity that Christ has given us. What were they simply seemingly willing to put up with? Those who preach a different Jesus offer a different spirit and a different gospel. We see this all the time. We just turn across the TV and see the different denominations that are on TV, and some of them don't even sound like it's Christianity anymore. In what area did Paul concede that he is untrained? In what area was this not so? He was untrained in speech, but he definitely was trained in knowledge. What practice of Paul evidently was used as a charge against him? Preaching the gospel free of charge. While at Corinth, from what did Paul receive support? Other churches and brethren from Macedonia. Why would Paul continue the practice of not accepting support from Corinthians? To cut off the opportunity for those who wish to boast that they were just like Paul. So how does Paul describe these opponents of his? He describes them as false apostles and deceitful workers. How does Satan often transform himself and his ministers? As an angel of light, as ministers of righteousness. It doesn't have to be much off for Satan to be able to get us to waver and sway from the truth. All it takes is a little bit. So they often just transform themselves. They look like the right thing, but it's just something that's just not right. How did Paul view the confidence of boasting? Not according to the Lord, as foolishness. Why did Paul engage in such boasting? Because others were doing it, and the Corinthians seemed glad to gladly accept it. Now, in what 3 ways was Paul equal to his opponents? He was a Hebrew, an Israelite, and the seed of Abraham. Now, list 5 things endured by Paul as a preacher. And these are some of his challenges. 5 times he was beaten with 39 stripes. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. And he spent a night and a day in the deep. If Paul must boast, in what would he boast? And that's in the things that concern his infirmity. What event does he relate as an example of his infirmity? And this is the last question, number 16, and that was the escape from the governor of Damascus. So that is chapter 11. Next week we'll go to chapter 12. Thank you for your attention and your patience, And we'll be resuming Wednesday night services fairly soon. I think it's in June. Don't know the exact start of it yet, but we'll be back in church on Wednesday nights in June. Well, the date will follow soon, probably next week in the lesson. I'll let you know what time and date. It should be 7 o'clock on Wednesday at the church building. Thank you.